Hey everyone! Before we dive into this absolutely chilling true story from 1847 Mississippi, make sure to hit that subscribe button because you're about to hear something that will keep you awake at night. Share this video with someone brave enough to handle the truth and comment below what state you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. Now let me take you back to a night that changed everything in Natchez. My name is Isaiah, and I need to tell you about the night I was born. Though I shouldn't remember it, somehow I do. Every detail burns in my mind like it happened yesterday, not 70 years ago. It was March 15th, 1847, and the Mississippi River was raging against its banks like an angry god. The hawthorn plantation stretched for miles along those muddy waters, its white columns gleaming even in the storm's darkness. Master Cornelius Hawthorne owned 300 souls, including my mother, Mercy. I remember the pain that tore through her body as lightning split the sky. She was alone in the slave quarters, a cramped wooden shack that leaked with every raindrop. The other women had been called to the main house to serve the Hawthorne family's dinner party, leaving Mercy to face her labor with only the storm as witness. "Lord Jesus," she whispered, gripping the rough wooden bed frame. This child ain't natural." She was right. Even in the womb I could hear things others couldn't. Voices from beyond the veil, whispers of the dead who walked these grounds. The plantation was built on an old Natchez burial ground, and the spirits were restless. They spoke to me in languages I shouldn't have understood, telling me secrets about the family that owned us. Thunder crashed overhead as my mother's screams pierced the night. Through the thin walls, I could hear the laughter from the main house where Master Cornelius entertained his guests. His son, Thomas, was celebrating his engagement to some Charleston belle. His grandson, little William, was probably asleep in his silk-sheeted bed, dreaming of toy soldiers and sugar candy. 3 generations of Hawthorns lived in that house. 3 generations that had built their wealth on the backs of my people. The spirits whispered their names to me. Cornelius, the patriarch who'd inherited the plantation from his father. Thomas, the cruel heir who took pleasure in the whip. And William, the innocent child who would grow up thinking he owned other human beings. As my mother pushed, the storm intensified. Rain hammered the roof like bullets, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls. In that moment, something else entered the world with me, something dark and hungry for justice. "He's coming," Mercy gasped, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "Oh God, he's coming, and he ain't right." I emerged into the world during the loudest thunderclap of the night, as if the heavens themselves were announcing my arrival. But I didn't cry like other babies. Instead, I opened my eyes and stared directly at my mother with an intelligence that shouldn't have existed in a newborn. "Mercy!" Old Sarah, the plantation's midwife, had finally arrived, soaked to the bone from running through the storm. She took one look at me and stepped back, her dark face pale with terror. "Child, what have you birthed?" My mother held me close, but I could feel her trembling. "He was talking to me," she whispered. "Before he was born, I could hear him talking inside me, telling me things, terrible things about the masters." Sarah approached cautiously, her weathered hands shaking as she examined me. "His eyes," she breathed. "Look at his eyes, Mercy. They ain't baby eyes. They're old, ancient. I was born with eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and swirling with an otherworldly knowledge. When I looked at people, they said it felt like I was seeing straight through to their souls, reading every sin they'd ever committed." "The spirits chose him," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "This child, he's their instrument. God help us all." As if responding to her words, the storm suddenly stopped. The rain ceased, the wind died, and an unnatural silence fell over the plantation. In that silence, we could hear something else, the sound of weeping coming from the main house. Master Cornelius's youngest daughter, Mary, had just died in her sleep. She was only 5 years old, the same age as the slave child who'd been beaten to death the week before for stealing an apple. The spirits had already begun their work. My mother named me Isaiah, after the prophet who spoke of justice and judgment, but the other slaves whispered a different name for me, the Chosen One. They said I was born to balance the scales, to make the Hawthorns pay for generations of cruelty. In my first week of life, strange things began happening around the plantation. Milk soured instantly in the main house. Horses refused to enter their stables. The overseer's whip cracked in half the moment he raised it against another slave. Master Cornelius tried to dismiss these incidents as coincidence, but I could see the fear growing in his pale blue eyes. He'd stare at me when my mother brought me to work in the kitchen, and I'd stare right back, letting him see the judgment in my infant gaze. "That baby ain't natural," he told his wife one evening, not knowing I could hear every word from the kitchen. "There's something wrong with him. Something evil." But it wasn't evil that lived in me. It was justice. The spirits of every slave who died on this plantation had chosen me as their voice, their weapon against the family that had destroyed so many lives. Thomas Hawthorne, the master's son, was the first to truly understand what I was. He found me one morning in the slave quarters, barely a month old, sitting up in my cradle and speaking in perfect English to someone he couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, boy?" he demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. I turned my storm-grey eyes to him and smiled, a cold, knowing smile that no infant should possess. "The dead," I said in a voice far too mature for my tiny body. "They have so much to tell me about your family." Thomas stumbled backward, his face white with terror. From that day forward, he avoided the slave quarters entirely, but I could feel his eyes on me whenever I was near the main house. He knew I was different. He knew I was dangerous. As I grew, the voices became clearer. They told me about the Hawthorne family's darkest secrets, the slaves who'd been murdered and buried in unmarked graves, the women who'd been violated, the children who'd been sold away from their mothers. Every crime, every cruelty, every moment of suffering was recorded in the memories of the dead, and they wanted revenge. The spirits taught me patience. They showed me how to watch and wait, how to learn the family's routines and weaknesses. Master Cornelius had a weak heart. Thomas drank too much and made poor decisions. Little William was curious and trusting, always wandering where he shouldn't. 3 generations of Hawthorns, 3 generations of sin, and I was going to destroy them all. The night of my birth had been just the beginning. The storm that brought me into this world was nothing compared to the tempest I would unleash upon the family that thought they owned me. They had no idea that their judgment had already arrived, wrapped in the innocent form of a slave child who remembered everything, including things that hadn't happened yet. The dead were patient. They'd waited decades for their instrument of justice. Now, they had me. By the time I turned 5, the voices had become my constant companions. While other slave children played with cornhusk dolls and sang spirituals, I sat in the shadows of the plantation, listening to the whispers of the dead. They came to me at all hours, former slaves who died under the Hawthorne whip, Native Americans whose burial ground lay beneath the cotton fields, even some white folks who'd crossed the family and paid the ultimate price. Each spirit had a story, and each story added another layer to my understanding of the evil that ruled this place. "Isaiah," my mother would call, finding me talking to empty air behind the smokehouse. "Who you speaking with, child?" "Mama Sarah," I'd reply, referring to a woman who died before I was born. "She's telling me about the time Master Cornelius sold her babies downriver." Mercy would shiver and pull me close. "Don't talk about such things, baby, it ain't safe." But safety was an illusion on the Hawthorne plantation. The dead had taught me that much. The first spirit to truly befriend me was Samuel, a field hand who'd been worked to death 3 years before my birth. He appeared to me as a tall, thin man with kind eyes and hands that still bore the calluses of his earthly labor. "You special, little one," Samuel told me one evening as I sat by the creek. "The ancestors chose you for a purpose, but you got to be smart about it. Can't let the masters know what you can do." "What can I do, Samuel?" I asked, my 5-year-old voice barely above a whisper. "You can see the truth," he replied. "You can hear what they don't want you to hear, and when the time comes, you can make them pay." Samuel taught me how to move silently through the plantation, how to listen at windows and doors without being detected. Under his guidance, I learned the layout of the main house, the schedules of the family members, and most importantly, their secrets. Master Cornelius, I discovered, was slowly poisoning his business partner to steal his land. I watched through the dining room window as he slipped white powder into the man's brandy, smiling as his victim drank unknowingly. Thomas Hawthorne was even worse than his father. He'd sneak into the slave quarters at night, taking advantage of women who had no power to refuse him. I saw him assault young Rebecca, barely 16, while her husband was forced to work the night shift in the fields. And little William, innocent as he seemed, was already showing signs of the family cruelty. I watched him torture a kitten behind the stables, laughing as the poor creature cried in pain. 3 generations of monsters, each worse than the last. The spirits began teaching me other things too, how to influence the physical world in small ways. A whispered word could make milk spoil. A focused thought could cause a horse to buck its rider. A gentle touch could make someone feel inexplicably cold. I practiced these abilities in secret, always careful not to let anyone see. When Overseer Murphy raised his whip against old Moses, I concentrated hard and watched the leather strap snap in half. When Thomas stumbled drunk through the quarters, looking for his next victim, I made sure he tripped and fell face first into the pig pen. Small victories, but they gave me hope. The dead also showed me visions of the future, glimpses of what was to come if I played my part correctly. I saw the hawthorn family tree withering and dying, branch by branch, until nothing remained but ash and memory. Patience, Samuel reminded me constantly. The ancestors waited generations for you. You can wait a few more years to grow strong. But patience was difficult when I witnessed daily horrors. I watched Master Cornelius sell Rebecca's newborn baby to a trader from New Orleans, tearing the infant from her arms as she screamed. I saw Thomas beat Moses so severely that the old man couldn't walk for weeks. I witnessed William, now 8 years old, order a slave child to eat dirt for his amusement. Each cruelty added fuel to the fire burning in my chest. On my 6th birthday, the spirits gave me a special gift. The ability to see the sins of the past as clearly as if they were happening before my eyes. When I touched objects in the main house, I could witness every terrible thing that had occurred near them. The dining room table showed me decades of conversations about buying and selling human beings like livestock. The master's desk revealed documents detailing the rape and murder of slaves who'd tried to escape. Even the family Bible, ironically, held memories of being used to justify the most unholy acts. "You see now," said a new voice, an elderly Native American woman whose people had once lived on this land. "You see the weight of their sins. It will crush them, but only when the time is right." I began to understand that my role wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. The spirits weren't asking me to become a monster like the Hawthorns. They wanted me to be an instrument of divine retribution, carefully orchestrated and perfectly timed. The family started noticing my unusual behavior around this time. Master Cornelius would catch me staring at him during meals, my grey eyes seeming to look right through him. Thomas complained to his father that I made him uncomfortable with my knowing looks. Even little William seemed wary of me, though he couldn't articulate why. "That boy ain't right," I heard Cornelius tell his wife one evening. "He's too smart, too aware. Slaves shouldn't look at their betters the way he looks at us. Maybe we should sell him," Mrs. Hawthorne suggested, "before he becomes a problem." "No," Thomas interjected, and I was surprised by his response. "We keep him close. Better to watch a potential threat than let it loose in the world." He was smarter than I'd given him credit for, but not smart enough. That night, Samuel appeared to me with urgent news. "They planning something, Isaiah. The masters are scared of you, and scared men do dangerous things." "What should I do?" I asked. "Be the child they expect to see," he advised. "Laugh and play and act simple. Let them think they were wrong about you. But keep listening, keep learning. Your time will come." So I began to play a part. During the day I acted like any other slave child, running and playing, speaking in the simple dialect they expected, keeping my eyes downcast in their presence. But at night I continued my education with the dead. They taught me about poison, which plants could kill and which could cause madness. They showed me how to move through the house without making a sound, how to pick locks with a hairpin, how to forge handwriting. Skills I would need when the time came to act. Most importantly, they taught me about the Hawthorne family's greatest weakness, their pride. Each generation believed they were untouchable, blessed by God to rule over others. That arrogance would be their downfall. "Pride goeth before destruction," quoted the spirit of a preacher who'd been lynched for teaching slaves to read, "and a haughty spirit before a fall." As I approached my 7th birthday, the visions became more frequent and more detailed. I could see the exact sequence of events that would lead to each Hawthorne's destruction. Master Cornelius would die first, his weak heart finally giving out under the weight of his guilt. Thomas would follow, driven to madness by the ghosts of his victims. and William. William would live long enough to see his family's legacy crumble to dust. The spirits were patient, but they were also eager. They'd waited so long for justice, and now that their instrument was nearly ready, they could barely contain their anticipation. Soon, Samuel promised me. Very soon, the reckoning will begin. I nodded, feeling the weight of destiny on my young shoulders. The Hawthorns had created their own destruction the moment they chose cruelty over compassion. They'd sown the wind for generations. Now they were about to reap the whirlwind, and I would be the storm that destroyed them all. The summer I turned 12, the spirits told me it was time for the first move in our deadly game of chess. Master Cornelius's grandson, William, had grown into everything I'd expected, a cruel, entitled boy who delighted in the suffering of others. Today, Samuel whispered to me as I worked in the stables, today the youngest Hawthorn learns that actions have consequences. William, now 13, had developed a particularly vicious habit. Every morning he would ride his horse, Thunder, through the slave quarters at full gallop, forcing people to dive out of the way or risk being trampled. He thought it was amusing to watch grown men and women scatter like chickens before his mount. That morning was different, though. As William saddled Thunder, I was nearby, supposedly cleaning stalls, but actually listening to the detailed instructions the spirits were giving me. "The leather," whispered the ghost of a saddle maker who died on the plantation. "Weaken the leather where it won't show." I had learned many skills from the dead over the years, including how to work with my hands in ways that would seem impossible for a slave child. While William was distracted, boasting to his friends about his riding prowess, I made a tiny, precise cut in the saddle's girth, just enough to weaken it, but not enough to be noticed during a casual inspection. "Isaiah," Overseer Murphy's voice cracked like his whip. "Get away from that horse, boy." I jumped back, playing the part of a startled child. "Sorry, sir. Just cleaning the stall like you told me." Murphy examined Thunder's tack briefly, but the cut I'd made was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Satisfied that everything was in order, he stepped aside as William mounted his horse. "Watch this," William called to his friends, spurring Thunder toward the slave quarters. "I'm going to see how many of them I can make dance today." I followed at a distance, my heart pounding with anticipation. The spirits surrounded me, invisible to everyone else, but as real to me as the ground beneath my feet. They were all watching, waiting for justice to finally be served. William rode hard toward the quarters, where several slaves were hanging laundry on the line. As always, they scattered at his approach, dropping their work to avoid being trampled. William laughed with delight, standing up in his stirrups to get a better view of their fear. That's when the weakened girth finally gave way. The saddle slipped sideways, and William, caught off balance, tumbled from Thunder's back. But this wasn't a simple fall. The spirits had guided every aspect of this moment, and William's head struck the corner of the stone well with a sickening crack. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a gurgling sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Blood pooled beneath his golden hair, and his blue eyes, so like his grandfather's, stared sightlessly at the sky. Thunder, spooked by the smell of blood, reared and brought his hooves down on William's chest. The sound of breaking ribs echoed across the plantation like gunshots. "Master William!" screamed one of the house slaves. "Somebody help! Master William's hurt!" But I could see what the others couldn't. William's spirit, confused and terrified, standing over his own broken body. He looked around wildly, trying to understand what had happened. "You," he said, his ghostly eyes fixing on me. "You did this somehow. I don't know how, but you did this." I said nothing, but Samuel appeared beside me, his face grim with satisfaction. "Justice has a long memory, boy," he told William's spirit. "Your family has spilled innocent blood for generations. Now you know how it feels." The plantation erupted into chaos. Master Cornelius came running from the main house, his face white with shock. Thomas followed, already drunk despite the early hour. Mrs. Hawthorn collapsed at the sight of her grandson's body, her wails echoing across the cotton fields. "How did this happen?" Cornelius demanded, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "How did my grandson fall from a horse he's ridden 1,000 times?" Overseer Murphy examined the broken saddle, his face puzzled. "The girth snapped, sir. Must have been a weak spot in the leather." "Weak spot?" Thomas snarled, his grief manifesting as fury. "That saddle was made by the finest craftsman in Natchez. There was no weak spot. but there was no evidence of sabotage. I had been too careful for that. To everyone else, it looked like a tragic accident. Only I could see William's spirit, still standing there in shock, beginning to understand that death was not the end of his suffering. "This is your fault!" William's ghost screamed at me. "All of you! You killed me!" "No," said another voice, the spirit of a young slave girl who'd been worked to death in these very fields. "You killed yourself the moment you chose cruelty over kindness. We just helped you along." As the family mourned, I noticed something else. Master Cornelius clutched his chest, his breathing labored. The shock of losing his beloved grandson was taking a toll on his already weak heart. The spirits had planned this too. One death would lead to another, like dominoes falling in a carefully orchestrated sequence. The funeral was held 3 days later. The entire plantation was required to attend, slaves and masters alike. I stood in the back with the other children, watching as they lowered William's coffin into the ground. But I could also see his spirit, still confused and angry, trying desperately to communicate with his grieving family. "They can't hear you," I whispered, so quietly that only the dead could understand. They never could. That's why you never learn to listen to the pain you caused others. During the service, Reverend Matthew spoke about God's mysterious ways and how the young were sometimes called home early. But I knew the truth. This wasn't God's work. This was the accumulated weight of generations of sin, finally beginning to tip the scales toward justice. After the funeral, the family's behavior changed dramatically. Master Cornelius became obsessed with security, convinced that someone had murdered his grandson. He hired additional overseers and instituted new rules designed to keep the slaves under tighter control. Thomas began drinking even more heavily. Haunted by nightmares he couldn't explain, he would wake up screaming about voices in the walls and shadows that moved when no one was there. What he didn't know was that William's spirit, still bound to the plantation by his anger and confusion, was trying to communicate with him. Mrs. Hawthorne took to her bed and rarely emerged, claiming she could hear her grandson calling for help. She wasn't wrong. William's ghost did call out constantly, but his cries fell on deaf ears. The other slaves began to look at me differently too. They couldn't prove I had anything to do with William's death, but they sensed something had changed. Some were grateful. William had been particularly cruel to the children, and his death meant one less tormentor in their lives. Others were afraid, sensing that I was connected to forces beyond their understanding. "That boy got the sight," old Moses whispered to my mother one evening. "He sees things we can't see, knows things we don't know." "Hush," Mercy replied, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "Don't talk about such things." But Moses was right. I did have the sight, and what I saw in the days following William's death filled me with dark satisfaction. The Hawthorne family was beginning to tear itself apart from the inside. Grief and paranoia were eating away at them like a cancer, and this was only the beginning. The spirits were pleased with the success of our first strike. They gathered around me each night, sharing their approval and planning the next phase of our campaign. "One down," Samuel said with grim satisfaction. 2 generations to go." I nodded, feeling the weight of destiny settling more firmly on my shoulders. William's death had been just the opening move in a game that would span decades. The Hawthorns had built their empire on the bones of the innocent, and now those bones were rising up to reclaim what was owed. Master Cornelius's weak heart was already showing signs of strain. Thomas's drinking was getting worse by the day, and somewhere in the space between life and death, William's spirit raged impotently, finally understanding what it meant to be powerless. The first domino had fallen, the others would follow in due time. Justice, I was learning, was not a single moment of retribution. It was a slow, inexorable process that ground the guilty beneath its weight, until nothing remained but dust and regret. And I was just getting started. 3 months after William's death, Master Cornelius's heart finally gave out. The official cause was grief, but I knew better. The spirits had been visiting him nightly, showing him visions of every slave who died under his rule. The weight of their accusations had literally broken his heart. Thomas inherited everything: the plantation, the slaves, the crushing debt his father had hidden from the family. But Thomas was not his father. Where Cornelius had been calculating and cold, Thomas was impulsive and violent. Where his father had ruled through fear and systematic oppression, Thomas ruled through rage and unpredictable brutality. This made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. "He's lost," Samuel told me as we watched Thomas stumble through the slave quarters one night, drunk and looking for someone to hurt. A man ruled by his demons can't see the trap being set around him. I was 14 now, taller and stronger, but still careful to appear harmless to the White family. Thomas had become suspicious of everyone since his father's death, convinced that enemies surrounded him on all sides. He wasn't wrong, but he was looking in the wrong places. The fire started on a cold February night in 1849. I had been planning it for months, guided by the spirits who knew every secret passage and hidden weakness in the main house. They had shown me the old servant stairs that connected the basement to the upper floors, the loose floorboard in the library that concealed important documents, and most crucially, the faulty chimney in Thomas's study that had been leaking gas for years. "Tonight," whispered the ghost of a house slave who died in a kitchen fire decades earlier. "Tonight we cleanse this place with flame." I waited until the household was asleep. Thomas had passed out in his study, an empty bottle of whiskey beside his chair. Mrs. Hawthorne was in her room, sedated with laudanum as she had been every night since William's death. The house slaves were in their quarters, and the field hands were locked in the barracks. Moving like a shadow, I slipped into the main house through the cellar entrance. The spirits guided my every step, showing me exactly where to place the oil-soaked rags I'd prepared. But this wasn't random arson. Every flame was positioned with surgical precision. The fire would start in Thomas's study, where the gas leak would ensure a spectacular blaze. It would spread to the library, destroying the records of slave purchases and sales that documented generations of human trafficking. The dining room would burn next, along with the portraits of Hawthorne ancestors who'd built their fortune on blood and suffering. But the family quarters would be spared. This wasn't about murder. It was about sending a message. I lit the first flame in the study, watching as it caught the gas-soaked curtains and spread across the ceiling with supernatural speed. Thomas stirred in his chair but didn't wake. The spirits were keeping him in a deep, alcohol-induced sleep until the fire had spread too far to stop. Moving quickly, I lit the other fires and made my way back to the cellar. But as I reached the basement, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of crying coming from upstairs. One of the house slaves, a young girl named Ruth, had been sleeping in the kitchen and was now trapped by the spreading flames. She was only 10 years old, innocent of any crime except being born into slavery. "Save her," commanded the spirit of Ruth's grandmother, who died the previous winter. "She ain't part of this. Save her." Without hesitation, I ran back into the burning house. The smoke was thick now and the heat was intense, but I could see through it as if the flames were parting before me. I found Ruth huddled in the pantry, terrified and choking on smoke. "Isaiah!" she gasped when she saw me. "How did you get here? The whole house is burning." "Come on," I said, taking her hand. "I know a way out." I led her through the servant passages, moving with a confidence that should have been impossible in the smoke and chaos. The spirits were protecting us, creating a pocket of clear air around us as we made our way to safety. We emerged from the house just as Thomas finally woke up and began screaming for help. The entire plantation was in chaos now. Slaves running with buckets of water, overseers shouting orders, and the Hawthorne family standing in their nightclothes watching their ancestral home burn. But something was wrong with the fire. Despite the intensity of the flames, they seemed to be burning in patterns that defied natural law. The study was completely consumed, but Thomas's bedroom directly above it was untouched. The library was ash, but the parlor next to it showed no damage at all. "It's not natural," whispered one of the overseers. "Fire don't burn like that. It's like something's controlling it." Thomas stood transfixed, watching decades of family history go up in smoke. But I could see something else in his eyes. Recognition. Somehow he knew this wasn't an accident. "You," he said suddenly, his gaze finding me in the crowd. "You were in the house. I saw you come out with the girl. I heard her crying," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Went in to help." "Through that inferno?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "No one could have survived in there. The smoke alone should have killed you." Overseer Murphy stepped forward. "Boy's telling the truth, Master Thomas. Saw him pull the girl out myself. Brave thing to do." But Thomas wasn't convinced. He stared at me with growing suspicion, and I could see the wheels turning in his alcohol-addled brain. He was beginning to connect dots that others couldn't see. The fire burned for 3 hours before finally dying out. When dawn broke, the damage was extensive but strangely selective. The study, library, and dining room were completely destroyed. The kitchen was badly damaged, but the family bedrooms, the parlor, and the front hall were virtually untouched. Most mysteriously, several witnesses reported seeing a figure walking calmly through the flames, a young black boy who seemed immune to the heat and smoke. When questioned, they all described the same person, me. "Impossible," Thomas muttered, but his eyes kept finding me in the crowd. No one could have survived in there. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. No evidence of arson was found. The fire appeared to have started from the faulty chimney, just as I'd planned. The selective nature of the damage was attributed to wind patterns and the age of different parts of the house. But Thomas knew better. In the days following the fire, he began watching me constantly. He would appear suddenly around corners, trying to catch me doing something supernatural. He questioned other slaves about my whereabouts during the fire, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. "That boy ain't natural," he told his wife one evening, not knowing I was listening from the kitchen. "He walked through fire like it was nothing. No human being can do that." "You're drinking too much, Mrs. Hawthorne replied wearily. "The smoke and shock have affected your judgment." But Thomas's instincts were correct. I had walked through fire unharmed, protected by the spirits of every slave who'd ever died on this plantation. They had shielded me from the flames, just as they had guided my steps through the burning house. The fire had accomplished exactly what we'd intended. The records of slave ownership were destroyed, making it difficult for Thomas to prove legal ownership of many of his human property. The family's financial documents were ash, hiding the true extent of their debts. And most importantly, Thomas's sense of security was shattered. He began drinking even more heavily, haunted by nightmares of walking through flames and hearing voices in the walls. The spirits of his victims were growing bolder, appearing to him in mirrors and shadows, whispering accusations that drove him closer to madness with each passing day. "The fire was just the beginning," Samuel told me as we watched Thomas stumble through the ruins of his study. "Now he knows he's being hunted, but he doesn't know by whom. Fear will do the rest." I nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction as I watched the man who'd terrorized my people for so long reduced to a paranoid, drunken wreck. The fire had been more than destruction. It had been purification, burning away the symbols of Hawthorne power and leaving only fear in their place. But we weren't finished yet. Thomas still lived, still owned slaves, still believed he was superior to the people he oppressed. The fire had weakened him, but it would take more to bring him down completely. The spirits were patient, though. They had waited generations for justice, and they could wait a little longer for the perfect moment to strike the final blow. As I walked away from the smoldering ruins, I could hear William's ghost screaming in frustration. He could see what was happening to his family, but he was powerless to stop it. Death had not freed him from the consequences of his actions. It had only made him a witness to the destruction of everything he'd once held dear. The second domino was beginning to wobble. Soon it too would fall, and when it did, only one generation of Hawthornes would remain. By 1851, Thomas Hawthorne was a broken man. The fire had destroyed more than just his house. It had shattered his confidence and left him jumping at shadows. He'd rebuilt the damaged sections, but the new construction felt wrong somehow, as if the very foundations had been cursed. I was 16 now, no longer the small child who could hide in plain sight. My height and intelligence made Thomas increasingly suspicious, and I knew my time on the plantation was running short. The spirits had been preparing me for this moment, teaching me skills I would need to survive in the wider world. "They're going to try to sell you," Samuel warned me one evening as I worked in the rebuilt stables. "Thomas thinks getting rid of you will end his troubles." I wasn't surprised. Thomas had been making inquiries about slave traders for weeks, and I'd overheard him telling his wife that he wanted me gone before I caused more problems. What he didn't understand was that selling me wouldn't end his nightmare. It would only spread it to others. The buyer arrived on a humid Tuesday morning in July. His name was Jeremiah Blackwood, a notorious slave trader from New Orleans who specialized in difficult slaves. He was a massive man with cold eyes and hands that bore the scars of countless whippings. The spirits whispered his history to me. He'd killed at least a dozen slaves over the years, always claiming they'd tried to escape. "This the boy?" Blackwood asked, looking me up and down like I was livestock. "That's him," Thomas replied, his voice shaking slightly. "Strong worker, but there's something wrong with him. Something unnatural." Blackwood laughed, a sound like grinding glass. There ain't nothing wrong with this one that a good beating won't fix. I've broken bigger and meaner than him. As they negotiated my price, I felt the familiar presence of the spirits gathering around me. But this time, there were more of them than I'd ever seen before. Dozens of ghostly figures surrounding Blackwood, all of them slaves who'd died under his whip. "He's ours now," hissed the spirit of a young woman whose back still bore the marks of Blackwood's brutality. "We've been waiting for him to come within reach." The sale was completed for $800, a substantial sum that reflected both my size and Thomas's desperation to be rid of me. Blackwood shackled my hands and feet, then loaded me into his wagon alongside 3 other slaves he'd purchased from neighboring plantations. "Don't worry, boy," he said with a cruel smile. "Where you're going, you'll learn to keep your mouth shut and your eyes down. I guarantee it." But as we rode away from the hawthorn plantation, I felt no fear. The spirits were with me, and they had plans for Jeremiah Blackwood. We traveled for 2 days, stopping only to water the horses and allow us brief moments to relieve ourselves. Blackwood was careful to keep us chained at all times, and he carried a loaded pistol that he wasn't shy about displaying. On the second night, we camped beside a creek about 50 miles from Natchez. Blackwood built a fire and settled down to eat his dinner, occasionally throwing scraps to us like we were dogs. The other slaves, 2 men and a woman, huddled together in terrified silence. "You're different from the others," Blackwood said, studying me across the fire. "Hawthorne was right about that. There's something in your eyes and something that don't belong in a slave." I said nothing, but I could see the spirits gathering in the darkness beyond the firelight. They were agitated, eager for revenge against the man who'd caused them so much suffering. "I've broken 1,000 slaves," Blackwood continued, taking a swig from his bottle. "Some fought, some begged, some tried to run, but they all learned in the end. They all learned that I own them, body and soul." "No one owns souls," I said quietly. Blackwood's hand moved to his pistol. "What did you say, boy?" "I said no one owns souls," I repeated, meeting his gaze steadily. "Bodies can be chained, but souls belong to God." He stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You need to learn some respect, boy, and I'm just the man to teach it to you." He reached for his whip, but as his fingers closed around the handle, something extraordinary happened. The leather began to smoke and char as if it were being burned by invisible flames. Blackwood dropped it with a curse, staring at his blistered palm. "What the hell?" The temperature around the campfire suddenly plummeted. Our breath became visible in the air, and frost began forming on the grass despite the summer heat. The other slaves pressed closer together, sensing something supernatural but unable to see what I could see. The spirits were manifesting. Dozens of ghostly figures stepped into the firelight, their forms becoming more solid with each passing second. Men, women, and children, all bearing the marks of Blackwood's cruelty. They surrounded him in a circle of accusation and rage. "Jeremiah Blackwood," spoke the spirit of an elderly man whose back was crisscrossed with whip scars, "you have been judged and found wanting." Blackwood spun around wildly, his eyes wide with terror. He could see them now. The dead had made themselves visible to their killer. "This ain't real," he whispered. "This ain't happening." "Oh, it's real," said the spirit of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 12 when he died. "We've been waiting for you to come close enough to touch." The ghostly figures began to close in, and Blackwood raised his pistol with shaking hands. "Stay back, I'll shoot!" He fired into the crowd of spirits, but the bullets passed harmlessly through their ethereal forms. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the empty landscape, but there was no one alive to hear it except us. "You can't kill the dead, Jeremiah," I said, standing up despite my shackles, "but the dead can certainly kill you." The spirits reached out with ghostly hands, and wherever they touched Blackwood's skin, it began to blacken and rot. He screamed in agony as decades of accumulated guilt and evil were literally burned into his flesh. "Please," he begged, falling to his knees. I'm sorry for what I did." "Sorry doesn't bring back the dead," replied the spirit of the young woman who'd spoken earlier. "Sorry doesn't heal the wounds you inflicted. Sorry doesn't undo the evil you've done." Blackwood's body began to convulse as the spirit's touch spread the rot through his system. His eyes rolled back in his head, and foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. Within minutes, he was dead, killed by the accumulated weight of his own sins made manifest. As his body hit the ground, the spirits began to fade back into invisibility. But before they disappeared completely, the elderly man turned to me. "You have work to finish," he said. "The Hawthorns still live and justice is not yet complete." I nodded, understanding. Using Blackwood's keys, I freed myself and the other slaves from our shackles. They stared at me in awe and terror, having witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. "What are you?" whispered one of the men. "I'm Justice," I replied simply, "and I have business to finish in Natchez." We buried Blackwood's body beside the creek, though the spirits assured me his soul would find no rest. Then I took his horse and supplies, leaving the other slaves to make their way to freedom in the north. They had suffered enough. Their part in this story was over. But mine was just beginning. As I rode back toward the Hawthorn plantation, I could feel the spirits riding with me. They were excited now, sensing that the end was near. Thomas Hawthorn thought he'd solved his problem by selling me, but he'd only delayed the inevitable. The dead were patient, but they were not forgiving, and I was their instrument of justice, sharpened by years of preparation and hardened by the fires of righteous anger. Thomas would learn soon enough that you cannot escape the consequences of your actions by simply removing the evidence. The sins of the fathers would be visited upon their children, just as the good book promised, and I would be the one to collect that debt. The third domino was about to fall, and when it did, the Hawthorn name would be nothing but a whispered warning in the wind. Justice was coming home. I returned to Natchez in the autumn of 1851, but not as the slave boy who'd been sold away months earlier. The spirits had taught me how to forge papers, how to speak like an educated man, and how to move through white society without arousing suspicion. To anyone who asked, I was Isaiah Freeman, a free man of color from New Orleans with business in Mississippi. Thomas Hawthorn had aged a decade in the months since I'd been gone. His hair had turned completely gray, and his hands shook constantly from drink and nerves. The plantation was falling apart, crops rotting in the fields, slaves running away in increasing numbers, and creditors circling like vultures. But Thomas wasn't my primary target anymore. The spirits had shown me something during my journey back. Thomas had a son. Marcus Hawthorn was 22 years old, fresh out of college, and every bit as cruel as his father and grandfather before him. He'd returned to the plantation just weeks after I'd been sold, bringing with him new ideas about slave management that made Thomas's brutality look almost merciful by comparison. "He's the future of their evil," Samuel explained as we watched Marcus oversee the whipping of a field hand who'd been caught trying to escape. "Stop him, and you stop the cycle forever." I established myself in Natchez under my new identity, renting a small room above a blacksmith's shop and presenting myself as a skilled craftsman looking for work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was hiding in plain sight, just as I'd done as a child, but now I was the hunter rather than the prey. The spirits helped me gather information about the Hawthorn family's current situation. Thomas was deeply in debt, having borrowed heavily to rebuild after the fire. Marcus was pushing him to sell more slaves to raise cash, but they were running out of human property to liquidate. The plantation was dying slowly but surely, but Marcus had a plan to save the family fortune. He intended to marry Eleanor Whitmore, the daughter of a wealthy cotton merchant from Vicksburg. The wedding was planned for Christmas Day 1851, and it would bring enough money into the family to save the plantation and fund Marcus's expansion plans. The spirits whispered a different plan to me. I began my campaign against Marcus subtly, using skills the dead had taught me over the years. A few drops of a certain plant extract in his morning coffee caused violent nightmares. A whispered word in the right ear spread rumors about his gambling debts. A carefully placed letter suggested that he'd been seen in compromising situations with slave women. But Marcus was stronger than his father, more resilient to psychological pressure. He dismissed the nightmares as stress, ignored the rumors as jealous gossip, and denied the accusations with convincing indignation. I needed something more direct. The opportunity came in November, when Marcus traveled to Vicksburg to finalize wedding arrangements with the Whitmore family. I followed him, moving like a shadow through the bustling river town. The spirits of that place were different, older, angrier, carrying the weight of centuries of injustice along the Mississippi. Marcus was staying at the finest hotel in Vicksburg, occupying a suite that cost more than most slaves earned in a lifetime. He spent his evenings gambling and drinking with other young plantation heirs, boasting about his plans to modernize slavery and increase profits. The key is breaking their spirit completely, I heard him tell his companions one night as I listened from the hotel's service corridor. My grandfather was too soft, my father too drunk. But I understand that slaves are animals, and animals respond only to pain and fear. The spirits around me stirred with rage at his words. These weren't just the ghosts of the Hawthorne plantation. They were the accumulated dead of the entire Mississippi River Valley, thousands of souls crying out for justice. "Tonight," whispered a voice I'd never heard before, ancient, powerful, carrying the authority of countless generations. "Tonight we end this bloodline forever." I waited until Marcus was alone in his room, drunk and vulnerable. The hotel's security was minimal, and the spirits guided me past the few obstacles that existed. I slipped into his suite like smoke, moving silently across the expensive carpet. Marcus was sitting by the window, staring out at the river and sipping brandy from a crystal glass. He was handsome in the way that evil men often are, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never facing consequences for your actions. "Hello, Marcus," I said softly. He spun around, his hand reaching for the pistol on the side table. But his movements were slow, dulled by alcohol, and I was already moving. The spirits had taught me to fight, and I was no longer the helpless child who'd been sold away. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to focus his bleary eyes on my face. "How did you get in here? Don't you recognize me?" I asked, stepping into the lamplight. "I used to live on your plantation. Your father sold me to a slave trader named Blackwood." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by fear. "Isaiah," he whispered, "but that's impossible. You're supposed to be in New Orleans by now, working some sugar plantation." "Blackwood never made it to New Orleans," I said calmly. "He had an unfortunate encounter with some old friends of his, people he'd wronged in the past." Marcus's hand finally reached his pistol, but when he tried to pick it up, the metal was so cold it burned his fingers. Frost was forming on the windows despite the mild November weather, and the temperature in the room was dropping rapidly. "What's happening?" Marcus gasped, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. "Justice," I replied. "Something your family has avoided for far too long." The spirits began to manifest around us, not just a few, but hundreds of them. The room filled with the ghostly forms of every slave who died under Hawthorne rule, every Native American whose land had been stolen, every poor white farmer who'd been cheated or murdered by the family over the generations. Marcus's eyes went wide with terror as he saw them. "This isn't real," he stammered. "This is just a nightmare. Too much brandy, that's all." "Oh, it's real," said the spirit of his own brother William, stepping forward from the crowd. "Hello, Marcus. I've been waiting to see you again." Marcus fell to his knees at the sight of his dead brother. "William, but you're dead. You died years ago." "Yes," William replied, his ghostly form flickering with otherworldly light. "And I've learned so much since then. I've seen what our family really is, what we've done to innocent people. I felt their pain, their despair, their rage." "I don't understand," Marcus whimpered. "You will," William said sadly. "You're about to experience everything we put them through, every moment of suffering, every instant of despair. You're going to feel it all." The spirits closed in around Marcus, and as they touched him, he began to scream. But these weren't screams of physical pain. They were the cries of a soul being forced to confront the full weight of its sins. Through their ghostly touch, Marcus experienced every whipping his family had ordered, every rape they'd committed, every child they'd sold away from its mother. He felt the despair of the slave who'd been worked to death in the cotton fields, the terror of the woman who'd been hunted down after trying to escape, the heartbreak of the father who'd watched his children sold to different plantations. It lasted for hours, though to Marcus it must have felt like an eternity. When it finally ended, he was a broken man, his hair white, his eyes empty, his mind shattered by the accumulated weight of generational guilt. "Now you understand," I said, looking down at the wreckage of what had once been a proud, cruel young man. "Now you know what it feels like to be powerless, to suffer without hope of relief." Marcus tried to speak, but only incoherent babbling emerged from his lips. His mind had snapped under the pressure of experiencing so much pain and injustice. He would live, but he would never be the same. I left him there in his hotel room, knowing that when the staff found him in the morning, they would assume he'd suffered some kind of breakdown from drink and stress. No one would believe the truth, that he'd been judged by the dead and found wanting. The wedding to Eleanor Whitmore was cancelled, of course. No respectable family would allow their daughter to marry a madman. The Hawthorne fortune, already precarious, collapsed completely without the infusion of Whitmore money. Thomas received word of his son's condition and rushed to Vicksburg, but there was nothing he could do. Marcus was alive but completely insane, babbling constantly about ghosts and voices and the weight of sins he couldn't escape. "It's happening again," Thomas whispered to his wife when he returned to the plantation. "First my father, then William, now Marcus. Something is destroying our family, picking us off one by one." He was right, of course. The spirits were methodically dismantling the Hawthorne legacy, using me as their instrument of justice. But Thomas still didn't understand the true scope of what was happening. He thought he was dealing with a series of unfortunate coincidences, not a carefully orchestrated campaign of supernatural revenge. The plantation began to fall apart even faster after Marcus's breakdown. Without his son's help, Thomas couldn't manage the day-to-day operations. Slaves escaped in increasing numbers, taking advantage of their master's distraction and despair. Crops rotted in the fields because there weren't enough hands to harvest them. By the spring of 1852, Thomas was forced to sell most of his remaining slaves just to pay his debts. The once mighty Hawthorne plantation was reduced to a shadow of its former self. A few dozen acres worked by a handful of elderly slaves who had nowhere else to go. But the spirits weren't finished with Thomas yet. They wanted him to suffer as his victims had suffered, slowly, helplessly, watching everything he valued slip away piece by piece. I continued to watch from Natchez, maintaining my cover as Isaiah Freeman, while the spirits kept me informed of developments at the plantation. Thomas had started drinking even more heavily, often passing out in his study, surrounded by empty bottles and unpaid bills. Mrs. Hawthorne had taken to her bed permanently, claiming she could hear voices in the walls calling for vengeance. She wasn't wrong. The plantation was thick with spirits now, all of them waiting for the final act of this long drama. The end came in the summer of 1852. Thomas, desperate and alone, decided to make one last attempt to save his family's legacy. He planned to travel to New Orleans and seek investors for a new cotton venture, using the plantation itself as collateral. But the spirits had other plans. On the night before his departure, Thomas was found dead in his study. The official cause was heart failure, brought on by years of drinking and stress. But I knew the truth. He'd been visited by every slave who'd ever died under Hawthorne rule, forced to confront the full magnitude of his family's crimes. His body was discovered by Ruth, the same girl I'd saved from the fire years earlier. She was a grown woman now, one of the few slaves who'd remained loyal to the family despite everything. When she found Thomas slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, she knew immediately that something supernatural had occurred. "Master Isaiah," she whispered, somehow sensing my presence, even though I was miles away. "I know you can hear me. It's finished now, ain't it? The family that hurt so many people, so they're all gone." She was almost right. Thomas was dead, Marcus was insane, and the plantation was bankrupt. The Hawthorne name would die with them, their legacy reduced to whispered warnings about the dangers of cruelty and oppression. But there was one more chapter to this story, one final act that would complete the circle of justice the spirits had been weaving for so long. The plantation was sold at auction to pay Thomas's debts. The new owner was a northern businessman who planned to convert the land to more profitable uses. The remaining slaves were freed, finally able to leave the place that had been their prison for so long. Mrs. Hawthorne was committed to an asylum in Jackson, where she spent her remaining years babbling about ghosts and voices that no one else could hear. Marcus lived on for several more years, but his mind never recovered from his encounter with the spirits. He died in 1857, still raving about the dead who haunted his every moment. And I disappeared from Natchez as quietly as I'd arrived, leaving behind only the legend of Isaiah Freeman, the mysterious craftsman who'd appeared and vanished like smoke. Some said I'd moved on to other towns, other injustices that needed correcting. Others claimed I'd simply faded away, my purpose fulfilled. The truth was more complex. The spirits had given me a choice. I could remain in the world of the living, using my abilities to fight injustice wherever I found it, or I could join them in the realm beyond death, finally at peace, After a lifetime of carrying their burden, I chose to stay. There were other plantations, other families like the Hawthorns, who thought their wealth and power made them untouchable. The spirits would always need an instrument of justice in the world of the living. But the Hawthorn plantation itself was finished. The main house was torn down, the slave quarters demolished, and the land converted to other uses. Within a decade, few people remembered that a family named Hawthorn had ever lived there. The spirits were satisfied. Justice had been served not through violence or hatred, but through the inexorable weight of consequences finally catching up with those who'd thought themselves above divine law. 3 generations of Hawthorns had built their empire on the suffering of others. 3 generations had fallen, each brought low by the accumulated weight of their sins. The cycle was complete, the debt paid in full, and somewhere in the space between life and death, the spirits of every slave who died on that plantation finally found peace, knowing that their suffering had not been forgotten, their deaths not unavenged. The last domino had fallen. The Hawthorn name was extinct, their legacy nothing but ash and bitter memory. Justice, as I'd learned, was not always swift, but it was always certain. 70 years have passed since the fall of the Hawthorn family, and I remain. The world has changed around me. Slavery has been abolished, the South has been rebuilt, and new generations have risen to replace the old. But some things never change. Evil adapts, takes new forms, finds new ways to justify itself. And so I continue my work. Today is October 13th, 1922, and I stand in what was once the heart of the Hawthorn plantation. Where the main house once stood, there is now a small college, Natchez Institute for Colored Youth. The irony would have killed old Cornelius faster than his weak heart ever did. But I'm not here for nostalgia. I'm here because of a letter I received last week, written in a shaking hand by someone who claimed to be researching the history of this place. The letter was signed Professor James Whitmore, and that surname made the spirits stir with interest. Whitmore. The same family that was supposed to marry into the Hawthorns before Marcus's breakdown ended that alliance. Professor Whitmore arrived this morning. A thin, nervous man in his 50s with the pale complexion of someone who spends too much time indoors. He carried a leather satchel full of documents and photographs, and his eyes held the fevered gleam of an obsessed researcher. "Mr. Freeman," he called out as he approached the spot where I was standing, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I've been trying to piece together the history of this place for years." I studied him carefully, noting the family resemblance to the Whitmores I'd known decades earlier. "What exactly are you looking for, Professor?" "The truth," he said simply. "My family has stories about this plantation, about the Hawthorn family that used to own it. Strange stories that don't make sense. I'm hoping you might be able to shed some light on them." He opened his satchel and pulled out a daguerreotype that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph of the Hawthorn family, taken sometime in the 1840s. Master Cornelius stood in the center, flanked by Thomas and young William, but what caught my attention was the figure in the background, a young slave boy standing in the shadows, me. "This photograph was taken in 1846, Professor Whitmore said, studying my face for a reaction. "The boy in the background, he looks remarkably like you, doesn't he?" I kept my expression neutral, though inside the spirits were stirring with anticipation. "Many people share similar features, Professor. What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But there are other photographs, other documents. Look at this." He pulled out another image, this one from a New Orleans newspaper dated 1851. It showed a group of men standing outside a courthouse, and among them was a figure identified as Isaiah Freeman, craftsman. The face was unmistakably mine, unchanged by the passage of 5 years. "And this," Whitmore continued, producing a photograph from a Chicago newspaper dated 1863. It showed a group of abolitionists, and again, there I was. Isaiah Freeman, activist and speaker. He laid out more photographs spanning decades. Each one showed me at different times and places, always using the same name, always looking exactly the same age. The evidence was overwhelming, impossible to explain by conventional means. "You don't age," Professor Whitmore said quietly. "In 76 years, you haven't aged a single day. What are you?" I could have lied, could have dismissed his evidence as coincidence or mistaken identity, but something in his eyes told me he already knew the truth, or at least suspected it. And the spirits were whispering that it was time to tell the story, to ensure it was recorded for future generations. "I'm exactly what you think I am," I said finally. "I'm the boy from that first photograph, the slave who was born on this plantation in 1847. I'm Isaiah, and I've been carrying out a mission for 75 years. Whitmore's hands shook as he put down the photographs. "That's impossible. No one lives that long. No one stays young forever. No one human," I corrected. "But I stopped being entirely human the night I was born. The spirits of this place chose me, Professor. They made me their instrument of justice, and they've sustained me for as long as my work remains unfinished." "The spirits," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking about ghosts. I'm talking about the souls of every person who died unjustly on this land," I said. "Slaves who were worked to death, beaten to death, murdered for trying to escape. Native Americans whose burial grounds were desecrated, even some white folks who crossed the hawthorns and paid the price." I gestured to the empty field around us. "This place is thick with them, Professor. They're here right now, listening to our conversation. They've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who would record their story, make sure it's never forgotten." Whitmore looked around nervously, as if expecting to see ghostly figures materializing from thin air. "What happened to the Hawthorne family? The records are incomplete, but it seems like they all died or disappeared within a few years of each other." "They were judged," I said simply. "Each generation paid for the sins of those who came before. Cornelius died of a heart attack brought on by guilt and fear. William died in what appeared to be an accident, but was actually divine justice. Thomas drank himself to death while being haunted by his victims. And Marcus experienced every moment of suffering his family had inflicted on others. It broke his mind completely." "And you were responsible for all of this?" "I was the instrument," I corrected. "The spirits were responsible. I was just their hands in the world of the living." Professor Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd told him. Finally, he spoke again. "Why are you telling me this? Why reveal yourself now?" "Because the story needs to be told," I said. "Because people need to understand that actions have consequences, even if those consequences take generations to manifest. The Hawthorns thought they were untouchable, that their wealth and power made them immune to justice. They were wrong." "But surely you're not the only one," Whitmore said. "There must be others like you, other instruments of justice." I smiled, thinking of the letters I'd received over the years from people in similar situations. "Oh, there are others, Professor. Wherever great injustice has been done, wherever the innocent have suffered and died, the spirits choose their instruments. We're not common, but we're not unique either." "What happens now?" he asked. "Will you disappear again? Move on to some other injustice?" "Eventually," I said. "But first I have one more task to complete here. You see, Professor, your presence here isn't a coincidence. Your family name is Whitmore, isn't it? The same Whitmores who were supposed to marry into the Hawthorne family." His face went pale. "Yes, but that was my great-uncle's family. They had nothing to do with slavery. They were merchants, not plantation owners. Merchants who profited from slave labor," I corrected gently. "Merchants who bought cotton picked by enslaved hands and sold goods to plantation owners. Your family may not have owned slaves directly, Professor, but they were part of the system that made slavery profitable." "But that was generations ago," he protested. "I had nothing to do with it. I've spent my life fighting against injustice, researching these stories to make sure they're remembered." "I know," I said, "and that's why you're here. The spirits don't want revenge against you, Professor. They want redemption. They want their stories told by someone who will treat them with respect and dignity." I reached into my coat and pulled out a leather journal, its pages filled with decades of careful notes. "This contains everything: the true history of the Hawthorne plantation, the names of every slave who died here, the details of their lives and deaths. The spirits have been helping me compile it for 70 years. Whitmore took the journal with trembling hands. "You want me to publish this? I want you to make sure it's never forgotten," I said. "The Hawthorns are gone, but the system that created them lives on in new forms. People need to understand that injustice always carries a price, even if that price takes generations to collect." As I spoke, the air around us began to shimmer, and Professor Whitmore gasped as dozens of ghostly figures became visible. Men, women, and children of all ages, all bearing the marks of hard lives and violent deaths. They stood in a circle around us, their faces peaceful for the first time in decades. "They're beautiful," Whitmore whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I can feel their pain, but also their forgiveness." "They've waited a long time for someone to tell their stories properly," I said. "Someone who would see them as people, not just victims. You're that person, Professor." The spirits began to fade, but not before each one nodded to Whitmore in acknowledgement and gratitude. They were finally at peace, their stories preserved for future generations. "What about you?" Whitmore asked as the last of the ghosts disappeared. "What happens to you now?" I looked around at the empty field, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I'd carried for 3/4 of a century. "Now I rest," I said. "My work here is finished. The spirits have found their peace and their stories will live on through your research. But you'll continue elsewhere?" "Perhaps," I said. "There's always injustice in the world, always innocent people who need someone to speak for them. But for now, I'm tired. I've been carrying the weight of the dead for a very long time." Professor Whitmore nodded, clutching the journal to his chest. "I'll make sure their stories are told. I promise. I know you will," I said. "That's why they chose you." As the sun began to set over the former hawthorn plantation, I felt the familiar presence of the spirits one last time. But now they were different, peaceful, grateful, ready to move on to whatever comes after justice is finally served. "Thank you," Samuel's voice whispered in my ear. "Thank you for carrying our burden all these years." "It was an honor," I replied, and it was. For 75 years, I'd been the voice of the voiceless, the instrument of divine justice in a world that often seemed devoid of it. I'd watched evil men fall and seen their victims finally find peace. The Hawthorne family was gone, their legacy nothing but a cautionary tale about the price of cruelty. Their slaves were free, their spirits at rest, their stories preserved for future generations. Justice had been served, slowly but surely, just as it always is in the end. As I walked away from the field where so much suffering had occurred, I felt myself beginning to fade. My work was done, my purpose fulfilled. The spirits no longer needed me to carry their burden. Professor Whitmore would tell their stories. The world would remember what happened here, and somewhere in the space between life and death, the souls of the innocent would finally know peace. The last chapter of the Hawthorne saga was complete. The circle of justice was closed, and I was finally free to rest.